Hello, welcome to watercolor class. I wanted to do an introduction to getting set up before actually starting the how to watercolor portion of the class. So this is kind of like a bonus beforehand thing, and I'll turn it around. Hi. Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of dark there. All right, but you can see me. The window is behind me with the lighting, and then here we have a table with some watercolor supplies on it. And the things that I wanted to talk about today briefly are the brushes, the paint, paper, types of paper, stretching the paper, which I will show you how to do in this video today. That way you can be prepared for the first watercolor and you're like, okay, I did it. I've got my piece of paper ready. And then I'll show a couple of examples of some watercolors just right at the end. All right, so let's see about a few things with watercolor. First of all, the brushes. So in the email I said that you need several kinds of brushes. You might already have these brushes. It's good to have brushes that are specific to watercolor so that they don't have a lot of junk inside of the brush, say from acrylic or oil, and then it gets all clogged up and it's hard to use for watercolor. You can use the synthetic bristles or the natural bristles. Either is fine. If you use natural bristle, it will absorb, it will grab hold of the water better, so it's nicer, but they are more expensive, so don't worry about exactly which kind you have. But first of all, you will need a mop brush, and then it will usually say mop on there. This one, I don't know if it's going to focus and show you that. It says mop on it. So then you know. It doesn't have to be super big, but it's like a larger type of brush that's for the bigger washy areas. Next, you will want a pointy brush, a round brush that is pointy on the end. Once you wet it, it should form a nice point. This is a size number 6. I think if you have a 7 or a 5, it's still fine. But this is a good size to work with. And then something smaller for details. So if you want to add like a little thin line on there, it's helpful to have a tiny brush. This one is a size 2. This one is a size 0. It's not really focusing, but it might. There it goes. So the exact size does not matter, whether it's a 2 or a 0 or a 1, but it will give you some good detail. Now this one is called a rigger brush. It's long. Some people don't really like this one so much because it's a little bit harder to handle. I love it because it gives me thin lines, but also see how there's more bristle, so it can hold more water. That way I can get a longer thin line if I want a long thin line, and I don't have to go like, okay, stop, get more, stop, get more. Okay, so that's the advantage of this one. It's just that it's a little harder to work with, and you don't have to have it. All right, so that is brushes. Next, I will talk a little bit about the paint and palette. It's good to have a palette. This is not expensive for a palette. It's got a thumb hole, but I don't actually use that when I paint. I just put it on the table and paint with my water and my colors. And you'll notice that I have all these paints squeezed out here, and I keep them in the palette because unlike acrylic and oil paint, you actually want them to be stuck down hard in your palette. So this area here, that actually needs to be cleaned, right? That's just me not keeping it totally clean here. I want to clean all of the areas off that I used to mix with, but the areas that are for the paint, to store the paint, I want to leave paint in there. And if I start to run out, like see this one is running out, I can squeeze more of my blue in here. And if this is still wet when I'm trying to paint, it makes it a little bit harder because then it's going to pick up a big gob of paint instead of just a little bit at a time, which is better for watercolor. Okay, so here I have paints. I buy them in tubes like this. They also come in something called a little pan, which looks like a little box with the color already pre-filled in there, a pan or a half pan. Those are good as well. There are sets that you can buy if you don't already have watercolor. You can purchase like a box set that has the tubes that you need, and you don't need specific exact colors for this, but you will want a yellow. I also use a yellow ochre or a tan colored yellow if I don't want a bright yellow. And you'll notice that my yellow is kind of dirty here. It's all right, we can clean it off. That's the other nice thing about watercolors too, is like if you have a color that's dirty but the color was dry when you were working on it, right? And then it's just the top layer that has that other mucky color on top of it. So I can get a little water on my brush and then brush it off, and then the color underneath is just fine and I can still use it. Okay, so a yellow, that tan color, which I know you can't really see it that well because it's kind of got a lot of mucky stuff on here too. Okay, which is the yellow ochre. I've got some brown, some black. I like the olive green just because I do a lot of greenery. It probably doesn't look too green on this screen here because it's dark. I've got a darker blue, a lighter blue, a red, and orange. Honestly, I don't use the orange that much. It's just been sitting there for a long time without being used up, and you don't need an orange for this class. But if you get a set that has orange in there, or if you get another kind of color, like I don't have any purple on this palette, but here's a purple that I could use if I want to. And then another thing that you'll notice is missing on the palette is white. That is correct. There's no white because the paper is the white, so I do not need white watercolor. In fact, I've tried using white watercolor before and it doesn't work that well. Okay, because you really don't need it. But if you wanted something to be sort of whited out, or you actually want to cover something with white, then I would go for a white gouache, which is not the same as watercolor. So it's something you don't leave and let dry in your watercolor set. So gouache is not the same as watercolor. Just like you don't want to leave your acrylic paint in there and let it dry up and it's like, no, it's ruined, right? So so anyway, but leave the watercolor in there and let it harden if you have it squeezed out. Okay, and that's a bit about the palette. I like the folding palettes because they give you a lot of space to mix your colors on. So I recommend the folding palette instead of the round palette because you don't have as much mixing area there. But this is fine, or those are fine too. Next, types of paper. If you go to the store and you're like, I don't know what kind of paper to get, why are there different kinds of watercolor paper, hot press, cold press, 100 pound or 140 pound, or is it like 300 pound? What should I get? Okay, the standard that I think is pretty user friendly is the cold press 140-pound paper. I just recommend that because it's more, I would call it user friendly, like it's easier to work with than the 300-pound, which is thicker, or there's like a thinner paper, but will like wrinkle and warp a little bit more. So anyway, here is a piece of paper, and then you also might be wondering, do I get a big sheet of paper? Do I get small sheets? Do I get it like in a ring binder version? Because there's watercolor paper that comes in a ring binder. That's fine too. But if you do get the ring binder version and you don't want the paper to be all weird and warpy when you're working on it, you'll want to do something called stretching the paper. And then you're wondering, but paper, it's stiff. Oh no, I can't just pull on it and it's not stretchy, right? But when you soak the paper in water, it actually the fibers do actually kind of stretch out some and bulge, and that's why if you don't have it stuck down, then it is going to bulge, and if you don't wet it first and then tape it down, and then yeah. So anyway, when I first learned how to stretch paper, my teacher showed me a way where you staple the paper, and that really gets a good grip on the paper, but that's a bit more challenging way to do it. So this is the easy version of stretching your paper. You will need blue tape and your piece of watercolor paper. If you get a large sheet of watercolor paper, you can just cut them down to the size that you want, no problem. And that may be a cost-saving measure too, because if you get one big sheet of paper, you could cut it maybe into 10 or even more pieces of the watercolor paper depending on the size you want. Okay. Oh, and one last thing I didn't mention is a board to tape it down to. This is a wood craft board that I got from Michaels. It was sold in a pack of 5, so yeah, it's not a single piece, but you might be able to get a single piece of it somewhere. Also, just say it's a wooden cutting board. That works too. One thing to pay attention to is if you have like a flat thing to tape it down to and it's plastic. The plastic doesn't absorb water the way the wood does, and you may get an interesting effect which is similar to salt. If you ever tried putting salt on your watercolor before and it makes a fun pattern on there, it may do some of that, but like all over it or something. That's what happened to me when I was young, and my teacher figured it out and was like, oh, that's what's going on. Okay, so I already have a couple pieces of tape here for taping it down, and I have some water. Normally I will just get water from the sink and not have a container to wet the paper, but for this demo purpose, since I'm doing it all on this table, okay, I'm going to wet the paper. When I do it in the sink, I just wet the paper and then I stick it to the side, and then I come back in a couple minutes and wet it again just to make sure that I'm really getting enough water in there. But see, if I have a dish like this and I do it this way and I'm soaking it, I could just leave it in there for a minute to let it absorb. This is something you can do to prep before you start next week. So if you're ready, you're waiting, you're like, I'm ready. Okay. Okay, it is ready. It's drippy. It's absorbed. I can see that it's absorbed some water there too. Just gonna take some extra water off of the paper and lay it down on the board. Okay. Then, oh, you know what? Some of these strips are not going to be long enough, so I'll get some new blue tape because the other piece here is a smaller piece, which is what I was using, the size I was using before. Okay, then before it dries, I need to tape it down. And you're like, but the paper's wet. It's not really taping down. Okay, yeah, I know. Okay, just the edge of the paper. And try to smooth it out so it's not wrinkling. I tend to press the tape on there a little bit and try to work quickly before the paper starts to dry. Okay. Press, press, press. And cover the edge. And that way the tape will cling to the paper a bit and help to keep it stretched out. So this doesn't work quite as well as stapling. Stapling will really grab hold of the paper and keep it in place, but it will kind of keep it in place and it will keep it a little bit less wrinkly. There are also blocks of paper that are sold where the whole edge is sealed up except for one little spot so that you can get in there and take the piece of paper off. Those are a bit more expensive to buy. If you work with those, they will also kind of bubble up and wrinkle while you're working on them. But once it's dry, it will flatten out because it's all sealed up on the edges. And then after it's dry, you can take it off and it will be flat. Okay, yeah. And then once you're working on these, if you wait until after it's dry before peeling off the tape, that will help to keep it nice and flat too. So that was brushes, paints, and palette, how to stretch your paper. If you have any questions about that, let me know. With blue tape, how to stretch it. And here are some previous watercolors. I feel like I've improved since these times. Look, this is from, I don't know if you can see that. This is from 2016. There it says from a trip 2016. Let's see what we've got. Oh, some flowers. Here's a boat. A seagull. What have we got? Oh, Lawson Volcanic National Park. Had a lot of fun there. Okay, so we're going to be doing some different types of landscapes. I will try to keep it, easy to follow along and not lose you guys. One thing that happens when you tape down the paper is it's taping over a little bit of the edge. So once you peel off the tape, you'll have a little white edge on there. If you want the whole painting to be a certain size, and then you're like, but wait, I want to cut off that edge later or something like that, then you can think about making your paper just a little bit bigger than whatever the size is, whether it's 8 by 10 or 5 by 7. I recommend thinking about not having a paper that's as big as the board, because otherwise it gets really hard to tape it down to the board that you work on. Okay, so that is it for today, and I will see you guys for when we start.